Yeah, but women don't want to hear that. They're not going to be turned off by that. If anything, it's probably going to be the opposite. Like, if anything, some of them are going to be literally sexually aroused. If you can be a mature, honest, reflective, vulnerable guy, there are women out there that will literally get horny in that moment seeing that. This whole idea that women don't want to see any men be vulnerable or admit weakness, I think is nonsense in my experience.
The most advocacy that I've seen for men to go into therapy is actually in red pill spaces. So if you go to other like more liberal spaces on the internet, it's like men are unsalvageable. They're trash. They're to be blamed for the patriarchy. Whereas like, you know, if you go to some red pill spaces and someone's like, I just got dumped by a girl, I asked her out twice, she didn't go, and people will be like, you know, get your ass to the gym, like go to therapy, like go take care, like build something of yourself, right? So they'll actually offer a lot of like positive direction.
Why doesn't the liberal trash talking of men resonate in the way that the red pill trash talking of men does? Like, why when liberals say men are suck, patriarchy, that seems to be very aversive to young men, but then when Andrew Tate says, you're a loser, you're weak, that does resonate with him. Is it just because it's...
Because in the first instance, there's nothing you can do about that. Like, you can't change the perception of men. And in the second instance, it's under this guise of personal responsibility. So they're reframing it as, instead of it being like a personal attack about something immutable, it's a personal attack about your personal decisions, about your own conduct in your own life. So if you're not going to the gym enough, that's something that you can take responsibility for and address and overcome, and you don't have to be in that spot. Whereas if you're coming at it from a perspective of like, well, all men are trash, there's nothing you can do about that, right?
Yeah, I guess I'll just leave that question as it is.
So it's a brilliant question. I've never really thought about it before, but the first thing that comes to mind is that, so I think a big problem...
Absolute cap on red pill men suggesting therapy more. Yeah, that is very questionable. Is therapy normal in red pill spaces? I feel like there's no way that's true. I feel like the common theme when it comes to therapy is that it's a sign of weakness, but my personal opinion, I think literally everybody should go to therapy at some point in their lives. It's not really what most people think it is before they go. I feel like when I first went to therapy, I built it up in my head to be this like Goodwill Hunting kind of thing, you know? So I remember being like 19 years old and going to therapy for the first time. And I remember literally trying to like emulate Matt Damon in Goodwill Hunting. It's like, I'm going to be he's not going to figure me out. You know, I went in with a game plan where I was going to be like standoffish. You don't know me. I'm smarter than, like before you go to therapy, you think it's going to be like a few sessions, and then you're going to have this burning bush, like cathartic epiphanal experience where everything just makes sense. And your therapist is going to stand you up and tell you it's not your fault. And you're just going to cry, and then you're going to be fixed. And meanwhile, therapy in real life, it's like, you know, you go for 3 years until you have a mild breakthrough. I don't know how therapy is for other people, but for me, therapy is like, it's something that you like, it's something that makes, I feel like it makes you a better person. It makes you a more honest broker when it comes to doing an inventory on yourself, but it's something that happens over time. So you'll be going to therapy for 2 years, and a lot of the sessions you feel like you didn't get anything out of. You're like, I don't know, I felt like that was a waste of time. Didn't really feel any emotions. But then you'll go through some experience in your life, something that maybe you might have historically found challenging, some particular kind of experience. And then you handle it in a different way. You handle it better without thinking about it. You react to the situation better. You don't lose your temper. You don't lose your composure. You're able to navigate that situation better. And then after the fact, you're like, I actually handled that way better than I would have before. For me, like progress in therapy is very subtle. It doesn't happen right away. And when it does happen, it kind of sneaks up on you. You're just like, oh, wow. I think 3 years ago, I would have lost my shit. And in that situation, I was able to like have a mature conversation and have it not devolve into a shouting match or whatever. Like my relationship has been a really good marker for me in terms of personal development. Like I know now that if some kind of conflict happens with me and Esme, like I'm much better about taking time for myself if I need time. Like, cause like everybody gets overwhelmed sometimes. So like I'm much more inclined now to identify like, oh, okay, there's some tension here. There's some conflict. There's some potential for the tension to escalate. I'm not in a space right now where I feel like I can have this conversation. So I'm just going to take a little space and then come back. And then also the conversely, like I'm able to now give space when maybe it was harder before. So like maybe like 10 years ago, a big thing for me in relationships was any kind of conflict. I needed to have that conflict resolved right away. Any kind of situation where the conflict was left open-ended and unresolved, it felt like a gaping open wound for me. Like I couldn't be at peace if there was any kind of tension. And now, 10 years into the relationship and after like lots of therapy or whatever, I'm able to compartmentalize in my head and think to myself, okay, we've been through tension before, we've got through it. I'm not in a space right now to talk about it, but I know I will be like tomorrow or maybe 3 hours from now, maybe 20 minutes from now. But that's like I feel like I'm probably not the only person to struggle with like that. And I feel like that's a big kind of step that you take in a relationship, is like learning how to take space and give space and having confidence in yourself and the relationship and your partner that you will be able to overcome that stuff. So yeah, I don't know. There's no way I would have been able to do that without therapy. No way. There's no way I would have been able to get to that point without therapy. Me personally, maybe other people can get there kind of on their own without any kind of help, and they can just sort of intuitively mature in that way. But that wasn't my case. I needed somebody else to give me a different perspective.
Problem with sort of the way that like a lot of men are treated is that we're held responsible for something that was not ours to create. Like the patriarchy is a great example. Like you can talk about the patriarchy, we tend to be blamed for things that we didn't do. So there's a big difference between me as a man am blamed for sexual assault in the world. Like that is a completely unactionable claim to lay at my feet, right? I don't, maybe I'm responsible for it, but I don't think I am. So that there's a lot of like, so that energy of blaming men doesn't come from like a masculine place, right? Oftentimes it comes from a feminine place. So I'm not saying it's right or wrong. It's just like it's coming from a very different place. Whereas the other thing is that it's not clear what the action is. Whereas like oftentimes, so men are raised to be like very independent, right? Like, so one of the reasons we have a male mental health crisis is because we're really the one class of people who society doesn't care to help. So, and speaking of, what happened in this election, it's really interesting because if you look at the Democratic Party's website, I don't know if y'all have ever seen who they want to help. So they'll list like 12 or 13 groups of people: rural people, LGBTQ people, people of different ethnicities. And then at the very end, they say women, but there's no men.
It's very frustrating that liberals and progressives have all of the theoretical academic framework and all of the understanding for describing these types of issues, but for some reason, especially when it comes to white men, they cannot apply it at all, or they don't, or it's a political thing. Funny enough, to go back to that conversation with O'Malley, I asked him a question of, do you think that the Democratic Party is going to increase their messaging when it comes to especially young white men, like their issues? And he did this thing.
I feel like I've always been resistant to this idea, this idea that young men or men in general, and specifically white men, don't get the kind of support they need. There's been a part of me that's always kind of naturally resisted that because my experience in life is really informed by recovery circles. So like I was 20 years old, I went to rehab, and then I was in recovery for, like NA meetings, regular NA meetings, very plugged into that community, had commitments, had a sponsor, had sponsees. All my friends were in recovery. That was a program that was very kind of egalitarian in its structure. Like anybody who asked for support and was willing to do some kind of footwork got support. And so I never experienced that lack of support. I never felt like as a man or a young man or as a white man, I couldn't get the kind of support that I needed if I asked for help. Because my experience was just totally different in NA. I did get that support. People asked for support from me. Like NA to me in recovery spaces is some of the most wholesome examples of how human beings can be selfless that I've ever witnessed. Like more so than church. It's just like, what is AA and what is NA at its core? It's just strangers showing up to be a part of a group, and the whole point of the group is to help other people. Like So that to me, I just couldn't, I never related to this. I never felt alienated. I never felt like I couldn't get support. If you're not in recovery spaces, then, you know, maybe your experience is going to be totally different. And so maybe you did feel alienated and isolated. But I think I was biased by my own experiences in life. Like I think I was quick to dismiss this idea of young men feeling like they can't get support because that just wasn't my experience in this really kind of specific format of recovery.
I remember people would do in the past to women, where if a woman were to say something like, women have this issue, it'd be like, what about male sexuality? Okay, well, women have this issue. Well, what about false accusations? And it's like if you're a woman, you can't complain, 10, 15 years ago about anything without a guy saying like, well, what about my issues? And it was funny because when I asked him that question, like, what about young white men? He was, and a great guy, really cool. And he spoke a little bit later about this, but he said, we don't want to help just young white men. We want to help everybody. And it was that like, well, fuck me.
You're lucky then. Lots of, if not most men are told to not seek help, told to eat their feelings, walk off pain. No, like I definitely experienced the same pressures. My instinct still to this day, if I get upset to the point where I'm feeling like I'm welling up and tears are coming, my autonomous physical response that I cannot control still to this day, after therapy, after recovery, my instinct is to turtle up and like fight those feelings. And that's a really interesting concept to me because laughing and crying, when you think about it, feel very similar. Have you guys ever noticed that? Like a really good laugh, a deep belly laugh, kind of feels very adjacent to an uncontrollable sob. It's just this natural body response that human beings have to laugh or to cry. And yet, as a man, my instinct when the cry starts coming up, my instinct is to squash it. My body gets physically tense. My body physically, like there's like so as I'm emotionally trying to stuff that thing, I can feel my body like physically tensing up as if to squash that feeling. So it's not like I'm immune to that same kind of social pressure that men feel to not go through those feelings, to not express vulnerability or weakness or ask for help. I've had the enormous benefit of being exposed to stuff like recovery circles where it's completely normal to, and it's an interesting experience. Like when I've introduced Esme to some of my old NA friends for the first time, and then we're all hanging out, it's a totally different vibe. And I had ex-girlfriends before who experienced the same thing. Because you'll go to hang out with these people, and when you ask these people, like some of my best friends from recovery spaces, like, hey man, how are you doing? It's not abnormal at all to get a very honest response to that question. Oh yeah, I'm struggling a bit right now with insecurity. I'm going back to school, and I got a lot of negative self-talk going on, and I feel like I probably can't perform at the level that I need to, and there's just a lot of self-doubt, and I'm eating my feelings. So I'm dealing with that just by eating a lot of food, but other than that, things are pretty good. And so like, it was like a system shock for Esme and some other ex-girlfriends who have like been around that. I'll frequently hear that was like, you never hear people talk that way, but that's like very, very normal. That's very, very normal in recovery spaces. Like hopefully you get to a point where you're able to identify difficult feelings and experiences and talk about it honestly. And then hopefully in doing so, you can kind of remove some of the difficulties of it. Like part of the difficulties of going through an experience like insecurity and self-doubt is when you keep it all to yourself. You don't want to talk about it. Like you don't want other people to know that you're feeling vulnerable, that you're feeling exposed, that you're feeling inadequate in some way. And so, that process of like hanging on to it and not sharing it with anyone it makes it worse. If you can get to a point where you can talk very casually about the things that you struggle with, it takes a lot of the power out of those negative feelings. So if you can find that, like maybe get addicted to drugs, maybe become an alcoholic, and then you can no, I'm just kidding, obviously. But like, I really don't know what to suggest for people that don't struggle with substance abuse, because for me, there's like a program for that. And that's like where I got my, a lot of the profound life lessons that have informed me in my maturing process over the years came from recovery. I don't really know what, where do you go if you're not addicted to drugs? I really don't know where you can get something similar I guess if you ask a lot of young men, they'll tell you, you go to red pill spaces and you join a Discord or a subreddit or whatever. And then, that's how you find your community and blah, blah, blah.
The delegitimizing. I was like, this is the.
Yeah, but women don't want to hear that shit. No, it's not just women. I think what people don't want to hear is like a self-victimizing thing. Like if you're around someone and whenever you're around them, they're constantly talking about and I've been guilty of this at times in my life, but if you're hanging around with someone who's constantly in a state of crisis or constantly in a state of like negative self-talk or victimization, and they're not displaying any kind of effort to like address the problem in a real way. Like some people, when you hang out with them, it seems like they're resigned to feeling depressed 24/7 about themselves, about the circumstances. That's not just like a men or a women thing. It's not like women don't want to be around that. Nobody wants to be around that. Like nobody does. Like hopefully in that situation, that person has friends that are patient and can lend a little bit of grace, and like, but I feel like most women, I want to say like 95% of women are probably going to be super appreciative of a guy who is emotionally mature enough to go through those processes without punching holes in the wall. They're not going to be turned off by that. If anything, it's probably going to be the opposite. Like if anything, some of them are going to be literally sexually aroused. If you can be a mature, honest, reflective, vulnerable guy, there are women out there that will literally get horny in that moment seeing that. This whole idea that women don't want to see any man be vulnerable or admit weakness, I think is nonsense in my experience. That's just my experience. I don't know what kind of women you're hanging out with, but whatever.
Same thing that people will do sometimes to minorities. Yeah, like African Americans, somebody will complain.
Right. So
everybody has poverty. Yeah.
Right. So Black Lives Matter, all lives matter.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah. But all lives matter is okay in response to any majority group. Yeah.
So I think the really interesting thing is that, if you go far enough into wokeness, you will discover systemic bias against men.
Yeah, which is
right. So there's a certain amount of wokeness where people stay asleep. And very intentionally so.
You think intentionally so? Or what do you mean when you say intentionally? Okay, yeah, okay, gotcha. Yeah, because if I had a person in a room and then a black person comes in and somebody's like, I'm very uncomfortable, it's over. And it's like, why are you uncomfortable? Well, I had somebody rob from me. It's like, you're being racist, you're systemic inequities, is horrible, this is the worst thing in the world. But if a woman was in a room and a man comes in and was like, I'm not very comfortable right now. And it's like, what do you mean, why not? I was sexually assaulted once, and then there's all this stuff. It's like, oh, okay, this guy needs to leave. And it's like, wait, what? There's a totally different treatment from a lot, from the exact same paradigms. You would imagine you'd analyze it somewhat similarly, but yeah, there's no space carved out. Yeah.
So I think it's like, I think something probably is hopefully going to happen. Like if we're lucky and things move in the right direction, something like what happened with feminism in the 60s should happen with men now.
You can be vulnerable, but it has to be fleeting and it needs to be unique and rare situation. You come to your girl crying every week. I mean, sometimes you do, like everybody in life is going to go through periods of crisis. It's probably going to last longer than a week. And so, if you go through something like that, and it's a process that plays out over a period of months or whatever, then, hopefully you're with someone that is patient and understanding and compassionate, but you build up trust in a relationship to get to that point. It might be difficult to get to that point. Like if you start dating someone and then a month later, they're already in a state of crisis. And, every time you hang out with them, it's like you have to spend emotional energy to sort of like help them regulate. It's probably going to be a bit much. But if you build up to having a relationship over the course of several months or years or whatever, then then your partner going through like a period of time where they're really struggling is not going to be enough to generally not going to be enough to scare you away or make you uninterested in the relationship. It just takes a little bit of patience, a little bit of practice. And again, it depends. Like if somebody is in a place where, they're really struggling and they're not doing anything to help themselves, I don't know how long that's going to last. Like, I don't know how much patience that, someone is going to have for someone in that spot. Like, You know, some people stay with people for years when they're exhibiting that kind of behavior, where they're going through some kind of crisis, but they're not doing anything to address it in any kind of meaningful way. You know, at that point, yeah, that's going to be really tough to hang on to. But if somebody's going through a tough time, you know, they're trying their hardest, then you're going to have more patience in a situation like that. There's a point where it can be enabling. That's the other thing too. Yeah. Like if you're with someone who is really struggling with something and not doing anything like meaningful to change their situation, then there can reach a point where you not stepping up and saying something or encouraging them to be more proactive about things. You can reach a point where you cross a line and you're actually like enabling that person to engage in self-destructive behavior. And you definitely don't want to do that. The biggest cause of relationship failure is not the ability to show feelings. It's generally the lack thereof and communication. Yeah, that and finances. Pretty sure financial stress is the number one killer of relationships. Could be wrong about that. Pretty sure that was the case for a while.